Hello, everybody. My name is Kenny D, and I am an alcoholic. I'm just really overwhelmed to be here with y'all this weekend, and I'm just incredibly blessed to be here. And I've had a chance to come to Louisiana a couple of times to do AA work, and this is the first time I've been able to bring my wife with me, and that was just a real treat that she was able to come, and our schedules worked out, and so now she gets to see firsthand what I've been telling her for a long time, what a really, truly beautiful bunch y'all are here. It's just a great feeling to be in your presence. And I want to thank the committee here, all of the people behind the scenes that work so hard to make this kind of a convention possible. And I want to take a special moment to thank Ray Roy, who first contacted me about this conference and asked me to come speak probably a year or more ago. And I want to thank my host, Brian. And Brian, I feel the same way. We just had a really great time, and they took me out and fed me some really great food, and I've just, this southern hospitality here in Louisiana is just fantastic. And there's nowhere else in the U.S. that I've ever been that has this kind of hospitality. So I want to mention a couple of things real quick that it works, it really does, is the theme for this conference. And I just found that out a little bit ago. But it's something that's close to my heart. And just 5 minutes before I was walking down here to come to the meeting tonight, I have a cell phone. My cell phone rang. And it was a guy in Seattle that I sponsor. And he didn't know what I was doing this weekend. He just called and said, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm pretty good." He said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "No, I'm just getting ready to go do a talk, actually." And it didn't slow him down at all. He said, "Well, I just wanted to let you know that I'm a grandfather." And what that means, where I'm coming from, is that he just sponsored somebody who went out and found somebody to sponsor. So he took somebody all the way through the steps. When they say it works, it really does. It's the spiritual awakening as a result of the work in the 12 steps. And he was excited about that, and he called to tell me that. And when I was at dinner tonight, I talked to a fellow named Richard, and Richard had the same story. Richard told me that he struggled in and out of the program for about 7 years, he told me. And I think he's probably here tonight. I don't see him. But he told me he struggled in and out of the program. He's waving his hand way back there. And he said, I struggled in and out of the program for 7 years or so. And he said, I finally kind of got it. And now I've been sober a little over 2 years. And he was really excited to tell me that he's now got his first baby that just celebrated a year of sobriety. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, I think, is that it works, it really does. One alcoholic sharing with another, experience, strength, and hope. And my experience with that is that when I put these steps into practical application in my life, these spiritual principles, this desire that I had to destroy myself with alcohol was removed, and it was replaced by this life that has a lot of purpose, and I come here to share that with you tonight. So I'm happy I had those experiences and got to share that with you tonight. I also just want to say one more thing before I take you. I'm going to take you back to my first drink here in a minute. And I want to just tell you that I am an alcoholic member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what that means is that if I take everything out of my story and just concern myself with alcohol, I drank alcohol alcoholically, and I belong here. Now, my story does include some talk of drugs, and that's why I say that, is to let you know that I am an alcoholic member of AA. And I'm not making any apology here. I'm just telling you that that's who I am, and I would be incomplete if I was to come here tonight and share a story with you that didn't include that. So I will tell you that that my first drink was at about 12 years old, and I came from an alcoholic home. My mother's been sober now many years, and I came from an alcoholic home, and in that home there was just a lot of chaos. I was raised by an alcoholic stepfather. He was with me about the last 8 years that I was in that home, and he was just a raging alcoholic. And our house was kind of the party house, so that's where everybody kind of gathered at my house. And it was difficult as a young kid in that circumstances to kind of hold it together and to get to school every day and to just do the normal things that I needed to do in my life. And we just had been kicked out of one house, and that house that we got kicked out of, that was the house that we had moved to try to make a real family, and we were going to really do it, and Mom was going to stay home. She was going to cook dinner, and we got kicked out of that house, and we'd moved to another new neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, I had to go. I went to my first year of junior high school, and I think I was just 12. Going to junior high school for the first time. I had an older brother who was 13, and I had kind of some stuff going on that made it so it wasn't really easy for me as a young kid. I was still wet in the bed as a young kid, and then I would, I didn't really have anybody around that was showing me about hygiene and those kind of things. So I wouldn't take a shower. I would just kind of dry myself off and try to find some clothes that didn't look too bad, and I'd put those on. I didn't brush my hair. I didn't brush my teeth. And I was just kind of the stinky kid that would go to school like that in a brand new school where I didn't know anybody. And then on top of that, my first real experience with trying to change my reality was that I would cut off the supply of oxygen to my head by grabbing my throat and squeezing as hard as I could, and then I would get this real euphoric feeling in my head, and I would let go just before it was going to cause me to pass out, and I would get this real euphoric feeling. So, I was kind of this stinky kid, and I hadn't brushed my teeth, and then I was choking myself, and then I would stagger around after I'd choked myself out, and so my popularity was waning just a little bit, and I just was having trouble really making a connection at this school because of some of these other issues. And so I just say that because I really needed a drink. I was 12 years old, and man, I needed a drink. Things were getting way beyond the place where I was going to be able to handle life on life's terms. And then my brother and myself used to go next door. We had this hippie that lived next door to this house where we'd moved. And we did this for quite a while, but once a year he would have his lawn mowed. And what that meant was that, the grass would be about 3 feet high towards the end of summer, and he would hire my brother and myself to come over there and mow his yard. So we'd go over there with big sickles, and we'd chop all this grass down and knock all the weeds and everything down and rake it all into piles and burn all this rubbish. And it would take us several days to get this done. And so when we were done with this, we asked this guy, would he be okay? I thought, well, let's try to get some alcohol. And because, I'd seen what it did to my parents. This wasn't my first drink, but it was my first time where I ever made a decision that I was just going to get smashed. I was just going to get my hands. I was going to drink as much alcohol as I could and see what happened. And so we got done with this, and we asked this hippie if he'd buy us some alcohol. And this was in the early 70s, and so being a good hippie in the 70s, he had no problem buying liquor for 12 and 13-year-old kids, and so he was like, "Hey, yeah, no problem. What kind of liquor do you guys want?" And I said, "Well, my parents used to drink Gallo wine out of the gallon jug, and there was always a gallon jug of that sitting on my kitchen table when I grew up, and so I said, well, wine. We would like to get some wine." And he said, "Okay, well, what kind of wine do you want?" And that alcoholic mind had started to develop, and I told him, I said, "Well, I would just like, I'm just concerned with amounts here. I just want the most wine that we can get with the amount of money that we have here." And so he said, "Well, there's no problem with that." And so he left, and he came back, and he had with him 5 fists, which are the big bottles of MD 2020. So, and I would love telling that story just for that reaction, because I could just go on with the rest of it, because is there any doubt where this story's going? And so we took this down to the school, and we got a few of the neighborhood kids involved, and even these other kids that didn't really understand what drinking was all about were telling me, "Kenny, we think something really bad's going to happen," because I was drinking as much as I could, as fast as I could. And that kind of became my MO in drinking. I would get cheap wine. I would drink as much as I could. I would drink as fast as I could. And I wouldn't stop until I was absolutely physically unable to drink anymore. And that's what I did that night. And there was a young girl. This was nighttime at the school, but she was like cutting across the school to go home. And I'd seen her at the school, and I'd kind of had my eye on her. But I was such an introvert at school. You know, I would just never took my eyes off my tennis shoes. But here with that bottle of wine in me, I just thought, you know, I'm going to take what's rightfully mine. And I ran down this hill, and I knocked this poor girl to the ground, and I tried to force her to give me a kiss. So there's a part in the book that talks about, you know, the horror of the memories of the next morning are unforgettable. And that was the deal for me. You know, not only was I this kid that choked myself and stunk and didn't know anybody in the school, but now I was the same kid, but I'd attacked a young girl. And so, and that didn't really help with the popularity deal much either. So, you know, it wasn't too long after that first drink that I started, you know, and when I want to just tell you something, my drinking never got any better than that. You know, that was my MO always. I drank way too much. I drank as much as I could, as fast as I could, and there was always some kind of a tragic result. I ended up going to jail a lot. As I got older, I got into a lot of fights. I ended up in the hospital a lot. I got injured a lot. I got into a lot of car accidents because this was just, you know, I was just out of control from that date on. And you know, during that time, I was removed from my house. I started doing time in juvenile institutions, and started committing crimes. And where I came from, they lock you up for that kind of stuff. And so I just, you know, that was just kind of my way of life. And I actually recovered a little bit in my early 20s. My grandfather gave me a job, and I started going to sea for a living. And I kind of recovered for a short period of time. And I actually had some minor success for a few years in my life, and got a few things. And I'd been homeless as a teenager a few times. I actually got a few things back in my life, and it was the perfect job. It was one of these kind of jobs where you could pretty much drink as much as you wanted while you worked, and they would pay you for this. And so I just loved that. And you know, I eventually got to a place with alcohol, and I started it short. It was a real short movement, or a short period of time for me, from that first drink to starting with IV drugs. And that was, you know, I was at 12 or something. I was shooting IV drugs when I was, you know, still as a teenager, and that continued right up until the day I got sober. And you know, that was a battle off and on that ended me up in a lot of hospitals and a lot of institutions, and caused me to commit a lot of crimes. And you know, from that place, I, you know, just got to a place where I could no longer work. I was in my mid-20s. I couldn't work any longer. And I just, you know, I lost everything worthwhile in life. Anything that I'd ever built up, I'd lost. And I started going to these, you know, I started just kind of living day to day, going to these hotels. And that's the way I was living. And I just would go into these hotels, and I would just, you know, the first thought that came to me in the morning was just, what kind of a pack of lies am I going to come up with today to get through the day? And I think there's probably a lot of people here that can really relate with that. And I gave that, you know, I lived that way of life for probably the last 3 years of my drinking. And I was at a hotel one time, and I kind of developed this habit of falling asleep with cigarettes. And it was kind of a bad habit to have. And it was kind of frustrating, too, because, you know, what would happen is I started feeling like life just really wasn't treating me right, because I would light up a cigarette, and then I would nod out, and then I would wake up and the cigarette would be burning my hand. And I would just think, it just pissed me off so bad. I would just think, like, is this too much to ask, to just be able to sit and smoke a cigarette in peace? That's all I want. I don't want to bother anybody. I just want to sit here and smoke a cigarette in peace. And it sure would be nice. Well, I was in this motel, and it was a place called the City Center Motel in Seattle, and it's not there anymore. They tore it down, and they built the big Holiday Inn Express. So, and this is, God, I hope that somebody from the hotel isn't here listening to this story. I mean, they built the big Holiday Inn Express where this hotel was. But I fell asleep, and I woke up, and the room was full of smoke. And I got this mattress fire going. And for anybody that's ever dealt with a mattress fire, and I actually got to sponsor recently, I sponsored a guy for a short time that was a fireman, and he told me, you know, he heard this story and said, when they have mattress fires, you know, they they don't mess around. They take the mattress, comes completely out, they shred the thing, and they soak it. It's the only way to get these things out, because if you ever get them going, if you've ever had one, and if you ever do have one in the future, this is something you might listen to, because it could help you out here. They're really nasty deals, these mattress fires, and I got to, I got some water and I put it on the mattress, and I passed out on this mattress. And at that time of my life, where I was at was I was just kind of getting by every day. And I wasn't living any longer. I was just kind of struggling to keep the body alive. And I was probably 50 pounds lighter than I am now. I was emaciated. My eyes were sunk into my head. I had tracks all over my body. I was alone in that hotel room, and there was very, very few people that would ever come and see me, and there was reasons for that there was only a few people that I would allow in, and that was only out of desperation that I talked to anybody. And that's where I was at. I had a pair of Levi's on. I was passed out in this bed that was on fire. I tried to put the fire out, and it started smoldering again, and it started going again, and pretty soon the room is full of smoke again. And I wake up, and I'm choking, and I'm thinking, man, I'm going to have to get serious here. We got a little bit of a problem. And so I went and found a big garbage can in the bathroom, and I fill this garbage can up with water, and I take that thing in, and I dump it out, and I go and get another one, and I dump it on the bed, and I go and get another one, I dump it on the bed. So now I'm like soaking wet in these Levi's. The room is filled with smoke, and I opened the door, too. And this was one of those old drive-up motels where you drive up, but this main drag out in front of it's called Highway 99 in Seattle. It's one of the main drags right through the middle of town. This is about a mile from the Space Needle. And so people are driving by, and they can see in that there's this guy passed out. The room is full of smoke. And then I woke up again choking. I thought, well, I'm going to have to cut this baby out. I'm going to have to get serious here. And I carried a little knife in my pack, and so I got this knife out, and I shredded this mattress, and I got it all opened up, and I got the water on there like you're supposed to, and I got this thing put out just like a fireman would do, and I got most of this fire out, and then I passed out in this bed again. And the thing is that the night before that, I'd gone on a little paranoid trip in this hotel room, and I tore up all the carpet in the whole room. Like I went around and just like ripped and tore all the carpet, and I pulled all the carpet up just in case there was anything under the carpet that shouldn't be there. I wanted to make absolutely certain the surroundings were safe. And so I pulled up all the carpet in this room, and so now with all this water, the carpet's kind of floating. And that night before, in a moment of clarity, I'd kind of gone around and tucked in all of the, I tucked in all the corners and tried to put the molding strips back up, tried to make it look as decent as I could. But now with this water in there, the carpet was floating, and I was passed out on the bed. And the door, of course, is wide open because I had to get the smoke out of there. And somebody alerted the manager that, hey, there's something serious going on down in this room down here. And the manager came and was screaming and yelling at me. And a good friend of mine, and I still talk to this guy, and he's actually sober as a result of an amends I made. And I'll just use that as a side note. But I actually got to make an amends to this guy years later. He called me wanting to know how in the hell I was staying sober and needed some help. And I flew down to Los Angeles and helped this guy get sober. And he's still sober today, over 10 years. But his job isn't that beautiful? His job at that time was to come by in the mornings, and he still had employment at this time. He wasn't quite to the place I was, and he still had employment. And he would come by in the mornings, and he would knock on the hotel room door on his way to work every day. He did this. And his job was to stop and check and see if I was still alive. That was his deal. He would just stop, and he would just tell me, I'm worried about you, dude. I want to make sure you're okay. And he came by that morning and saw me arguing with the manager, because my take on it, of course, was different than the manager's take. My take on it was that if he would have had a smoke detector in that room, which was required by law, by the way, I would not be in this situation where I barely escaped with my life. And he came by and he got all my stuff out of there. We got me in the car. And the thing about that story is, and I'll also mention that I can tell that story here in Alcoholics Anonymous in good conscience because of solid sponsorship. I went and made an amends to that guy. And so I stand here today telling you the story, having paid for all the damage to that guy's hotel room and paid him back for that bed. And so I'm telling you the story in good conscience, but I didn't even think about that. The thing about that is and one of the reasons I tell that story is because there was nothing unusual about that day in my mind at that time. As insane as that sounds, that was just a normal thing for me. It was just, I didn't like call anybody up on the phone and say, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what happened to me at the City Center Motel last night. I didn't tell, I just went to the next motel, and I had more important things on my mind, and I did not even think about that ever until I was in my amends and I was writing some stuff down. And one of the things that came out on my 8-step list was that I had destroyed this hotel room. And then I started telling the story, and people laughed, and I thought, well, geez, this might be a keeper. And I hope that I've used that story to help a few people. And I came out of that, and I will take just a minute to tell you about my last drink. I took my last drink, and the amazing thing about that too is I think I continued. I don't really know what the date was when that happened, but I continued in that condition for over a year. I do know that. In that same shape, doing that same stuff, and I somehow survived long enough to get to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I took my last drink at a bar, and I was at this place called the Buckaroo Tavern, and I went in there with just a few dollars left. I checked out of a motel that I couldn't afford to pay another day. I thought, I'll go up to the Buckaroo Tavern, and somebody is going to have pity on me and buy me a drink. I have enough money for 1 pint of beer, and I'm going to sit and drink that beer, and somebody will show up. And this was a place that was frequented by drug addicts and alcoholics and people coming and going from the penitentiary, and a lot of bikers. And I knew a few people, but I just sat there, and I could just tell that in the condition I was in, that the people even in that bar didn't want me there. They sold me the pint of beer, and you could just see it in their face that you sit and drink this, but then you got to leave. I could just tell that was the kind of deal that I just was drinking that, hoping that someone's going to show up, someone's going to buy me a drink. And I got that beer about halfway down, and something happened to me that happened to me a lot back then, which was that beer started coming back up. And I ran for the door of the Buckaroo Tavern, and I threw up on my way out the door. And obviously you can't really go in asking somebody to buy you a drink after you've done something like that. So I left, and I really don't even really recall what happened for the next couple of days. I'm quite certain that was my last drink. I did tell you that drugs were a part of my story, and I ended up behind a McDonald's in Seattle. And there was a little space between this McDonald's and this little Viking bar, and this place is still there. And there's a little space between these two buildings. And if you walk by it on the sidewalk and look in, you don't even realize that these two buildings aren't connected. There are two brick walls. They're built out of similar material. And there's a fence between these two buildings. But if you go around the back, you can get in between these two buildings. And that's where I found myself those last couple of days. And I wasn't sleeping there. I discontinued sleeping. And I was just kind of existing back in this spot. I was shooting drugs back there. And I could hear the people driving through on the drive-through in the McDonald's was just like maybe, closer than like from here to the middle of the room, and was the drive-through. And I could hear them. They couldn't see me, but I could hear this drive-through. And people would drive through and say, yeah, I'll have a number 3 supersize with the Diet Coke. And I thought they were saying, hey, somebody call the FBI. There's a freak back there shooting Coke. And so it was just like, I was just feeling like things are really starting to close in. And right outside of that, that same parking lot that backed up the parking lot behind this McDonald's, and there was an AA hall there named Fremont Hall in Seattle. And this AA hall, I could see the people on the back porch of this hall coming out after the meetings, and they'd be out there talking and smoking cigarettes and visiting with each other. And I could kind of make my way out from behind the building and look over there. And I knew a guy, a friend of mine. He was actually a family. His parents actually took me in when I was a kid at one time, and I lived with his family. So this guy was like a brother to me. And I knew that he was sober, and I knew he was sober in AA, and I knew that that he was going to meetings at this hall. And I thought, well, that's perfect. I'll go to this hall, and I'll find my friend Don, and Don and his wife will let me stay at their place, and they'll nurse me back to health, and they'll let me get sick on their couch for a few days, and they'll kind of take care of me. And I thought, this is perfect. And I just was completely out of game. I had nowhere to go. I had no money left. I like to say that that, I don't ever know when I'm going to be finished with the men's. I've been sober 16 years, and I forgot to say that in the beginning of my talk, but I've been continuously sober since June 8th of 1989. I got into the steps and the step work in the big book early in my sobriety, a couple months sober, and so I've been at this for a while, and I don't know when I'll ever, consider myself finished with the men's. The best I can tell you is that I stand here tonight current in amends, which means I've made all the amends that were on my 8-step list, that I don't have any names there. But the thing is like those last 2 days after that, I spent my, that money on that last drink. And for a couple of days after that, when I, up until June the 8th of 1989, I remember I was back behind the McDonald's there for a couple of days, and I had drugs. I don't know where I got them. I don't know where I got the money for them, but I know that I was doing something every day at that time in my life that I owed an amends for, and I lived that way for about 3 years. So, I went to the AA hall there, and I thought my friend Donner's going to be there. He's going to take me in, and I got to the hall, and it was a Thursday night meeting called B1. It was an 8 o'clock meeting, and I got to the meeting, and I sat on the sidelines. There was a lot of people in this meeting. And I don't remember anything anybody said. I had no intention of getting sober. I didn't want to get sober. I didn't even want to get sober. I just had no desire to get sober at all. And the reason is that I had attempted to get sober in AA for many years, in and out. And I'd never been able to stay sober, even for a short time. I'd been to treatment many times. And I was just sitting in that meeting, and I just started to realize that my friend's not going to show up. I don't got anywhere to go. I'm going to be real sick here in a short amount of time. And I just started crying in that meeting. Like big time crying. Like I just started crying like an empty, hollow kind of cry. And that means that there was no sound coming out of me. I just sat there in that meeting, and the tears were just running down my face. And I couldn't move. And I couldn't go anywhere. And I couldn't really say anything. I desperately needed to, and I love this idea that we are people here in AA who make the approach. Don't you love that? And the book talks about that. We are men, that the man who is making the approach, that we are the people who make the approach. Because I sat in that meeting, desperately needing to reach out and ask ask somebody for help, and absolutely unable to do that. Absolutely unable to do that. And thank God the guy that was chairing that meeting came up to me after the meeting and just asked me a real simple question. He said, would you like to go to detox? And I'm thinking, well, how does he know I need to go to detox? So I thought about my social calendar for a minute, and I said, well, sure, and he said, listen, if you'll go to detox, me and my buddies here, we'll make all the arrangements. All you got to do is just sit here. And there was a payphone out front. They went out to the payphone. They started making calls, and they made the arrangements. Said, okay, we're ready to go, and they stopped, and we got some cigarettes. I did actually have some money at that point. Like I said, I don't know where the money came from, but I had some money, and they stopped and made me spend all my money on cigarettes. And they took me to the next town up from Seattle, which is Everett, up north, and I went to this detox up in Everett, and I spent my first 5 days there and got sober there. And the reason they took me to that next town up is they knew that if they took me to downtown Seattle, there was a good chance I was going to leave, and I probably would have. Maybe if they had not done that. That next town for a guy in my kind of shape, they might as well have just took me to the middle of the Mojave Desert, because I just didn't have the game or the energy. I just didn't have it to leave and then try to panhandle bus fare and try to figure out how I was going to get to Seattle. There was nobody that would have come pick me up. So I just kind of sat there and toughed it out and got my first 5 days of sobriety. And I like to tell this story because I learned about giving in AA from an absolute expert. And he's a guy I'm still in contact with today. And his name's Al. And Al took me to that detox. He came and picked me up after 5 days. He took me to, he took me to meetings. First, he took me to his home. And I can remember his girlfriend saying, I remembered hearing him. He would say, hey, you got to stay in here. And he'd go in and she'd say, I could hear this, like, are you crazy? Have you took a look at this guy? And so Al said, well, listen, you can probably stay here tonight, but then after this, we're going to have to put you down to the car lot. And he owned a car lot in Seattle. He gave me a place to live there at the car lot. When I was 1 year sober, I was still living at Al's car lot, washing cars for him. And he gave me a job to wash cars for him for $5 an hour. And that guy was with me every day for 6 months. He would come every day for 6 months. He would come to the car lot. He would wake me up. He'd wake me up, and he would take me to Jack in the Box. He'd buy me a breakfast jack, and we'd talk. He was the first man I ever prayed with in my entire life. I was 28 years old. It was the first time I'd ever prayed with another man. So, I learned about this deal from a guy who was an expert at it, a black belt guy. And he's still that way. That's still his deal. He trolls the halls. He finds these guys and kind of gives them a hand for the first year, and then you're kind of on your own after that. And during that time, physically, I started getting a lot better. And I tried to do a little bit of the step work with Al, but it really wasn't his deal. It really wasn't my deal. And he sponsors people a lot different today, I will say that. But I just kind of got to this place where I was sober, and I just thought, man, I am going to drink again. I just knew that. Just knew it. And I started telling people in the meetings there that, man, this is great, but I know I am going to drink again. The time and day is going to come when I will take another drink. And if I take a drink, I am done for. And well-intentioned people would tell me, oh, my God, don't say that about yourself. But it was the truth. That was always been my experience, that these deals were always one more attempt and one more failure. And during that time, too, Al was paying me $5 an hour to wash cars, and I didn't really like to spend that money and I would never get on the wrong side of a $20 bill, so I'd always wash cars for an hour or two, and then I would stop. He'd give me $5 or $10 or $15, and I would head for the hall and go to some meetings. And I didn't really like to spend that money foolishly, so instead of buying my own cigarettes, I was shoplifting sober. And so I would go to this Hoagie's Corner, and I would go to the Bartell drugstore, and I would kind of case them both and talk to people, buy a candy bar or two. And then they always had the generic cigarettes on the counter there for sale, the cheap ones, and I would palm a couple packs of cigarettes and be on my way. And I did that, every day that I could get away with it. If I couldn't get away with it, then I would buy a pack. But if I could, I would steal them. And I started hearing some stuff around the hall there from a few people who just kind of had this message that had some depth and weight to it. And one of these guys was Jimmy R. And Jimmy R. was a guy who was not much more sober than I am, but he'd hooked up with this group of people who were working the steps. And Jimmy would come in every day. He was coming in and he was saying, man, I made another amends for this, and I made another amends for that today, and I made 3 amends. And then he started coming in and he said he was on his shoplifting amends. And he started saying, I went to 3 stores today that I used to shoplift from, and I paid those people the money back. I went in there and told them I used to shoplift here, and this is about how much money I owe you, and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in good standing. He'd have the whole day. He was doing this every day. It'd make me nervous. It was a smoking meeting, so I'd get so nervous I'd have to light one stolen cigarette right off the other, just because I just was like, Jesus, I wish this guy... He was talking about a type of sobriety that I'd never really heard about. I'd never really imagined, and I kind of got the idea that, man, there's something more to this deal. There's something more to this deal than maybe just going to meetings and just trying to stay sober, and because I'd never been able to stay sober like that. And God bless the people that can, but I just wasn't one of them. And I will say this, I really believe this today, and it's something that's close to my heart, that I believe that the terms are different for different people that walk into Alcoholics Anonymous. I've really come to believe that. There seemingly are, and I'm not making any judgments here at all about anybody, because I really have got freedom from that through inventory and other things about seeing how wrong I was when I was making judgments. I don't make any judgments about this. It just seems to be my experience lately, that there seems to be people who can come to AA and they don't really have to do that much to stay sober. They just kind of come and they hang out and they do all the unity stuff and they go to this clean and sober dances and come to deals like this, and their lives, they're relatively happy people. I'm not saying it doesn't work. Works for them. Didn't work for me. And then, so that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is a guy that does everything perfect, gets sponsorship, starts at the title page of the big book, reads everything, does everything that it says, gets up into his amends, and he stops making amends for a week and he's drunk. That's the other end of the spectrum. And And the reason I say that is I think, that is like the single most important thing in Alcoholics Anonymous, to find out about yourself. Because I am definitely a guy, half measures availed me nothing. If I do half of this deal, it's as if I had done nothing. If I was to do all that work and if I was to stop in my amends, it would be as if I had done nothing. That's just my experience. And I think it's so important. And I had great sponsorship and spiritual mentors. And somebody before I got up here said, tell them where you got this. And in 1990, I ran into a guy named Don Pritz at the World Convention in Seattle. And I'd already started working in a workshop. And I just want people to know that I had a 15-year mentor, AA mentor relationship with that man. And he's gone as of this last year. And it really changed my life. And he was somebody that through him and through a whole bunch of other people, they took me step by step through the big book. We started at that title page and we went all the way through that book, and it was in a workshop format. And as we went through that book, and we did everything that it said to do. And the idea was that these people had left precise instructions in that book, and if we did precisely what they had done, we'd get precisely the same results. And these guys had experiences in the book that they wrote about that said things like, that we've had deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude and outlook on life. And I knew that that's the kind of experience I needed to stay sober. And there was like an awakening that happened for me. And I, listening to guys like Jimmy, and then a few other guys started coming down, and these guys were doing what they call trolling the bottom. And they would just come to meetings and they would look for the face of hopelessness. And that was the message that I was left at the end of this, is, that my job in AA now is to go to meetings, not to get something out of them. And I'm not saying that I don't go for that reason sometimes, because I do, but that's not my purpose. My purpose is to go to meetings and look for the face of hopelessness and reach my hand out to the still suffering alcoholic as a man with a real answer. And so that's what I do when I go to meetings. And I don't have to look very far to know what the face of hopelessness is. I recognize it. And I recognize that I was told that I would recognize it because I'd been looking at it in the mirror for so many years. And so that's what I do today. And I just have these incredibly wonderful experiences. It wasn't no great attribute of my own. I was dying when I got here. I didn't have much of a choice on this deal. I went to this workshop because my friend Patrick started going. And he was also being sponsored by Al, who owned a car lot. And Patrick was 1 day sober less than I was. We were both a couple of months sober, but he was 1 day sober less. So I was kind of showing him the ropes about AA. And so showing, I was kind of showing, and I was like, I'll be darned if he's going to get a leg up on me and go to this workshop. And he was come back saying, oh yeah, they're going to build a spiritual arch through which they're going to walk free men. And I was a bit mixed up, a couple months sober, and I'm picturing like they're going to build like this paper mache arch, and we're all going to, wow, yes, and I was thinking, Patrick, that ain't never going to work, And but I started going to this workshop with Patrick, and we got up to a place where we were getting ready. We'd read everything. We started on the title page, and we learned about the 3 legacies, the unity, service, and recovery, and we just started doing everything that it said, and we got all the way up into about the 3rd step. And Patrick was a guy, like, I spent a little bit of time behind that McDonald's, but I usually had game. I usually had more game right till the very end than that. I was usually in hotels and stuff, but Patrick was a guy that was right off the skids. And Patrick had, by this time, found a room at a little boarding house, and we went to the workshop together. We came back from the workshop, and Patrick said, he called me at night after the workshop one night and said, man, I've had this incredible experience. He said, I came home from the workshop. I was laying here on my bed, and all this wind just started coming out of my body. And he was like, I just feel like I've been purged. And I said, I don't know. Do you think this has anything to do with that workshop and those steps we're taking? And, being his kind of, his quasi-sponsor with 1 day more sobriety, I was thinking, well, Patrick, let's figure this deal out. Because I was a little suspicious that maybe Patrick was cracking up. And so I said, well, Patrick, what went on there at the workshop? And we talked a little bit, and I said, well, how much coffee did you drink? And he said, well, I had a couple of cups of coffee. And I said, well, Patrick, I didn't drink any coffee at the workshop. And I didn't have any such experience. So it's obvious what we got going here is we've fallen into this cult that exists within Alcoholics Anonymous. And these guys are probably going to get, they're probably putting drugs in the coffee. And then they're going to get us to give us all their worldly possessions, forgetting for the moment that Patrick and I would have not been prime candidates for that kind of an approach. But, I thought, well, he's going to, this is some kind of a cult. And the reason I tell you that is because, that next Tuesday when the workshop came around, Patrick and I were both there. And I didn't really believe that. I was just trying to make sense out of what was going on for Patrick. But there was a part of me that thought that this may be possible. It was something I got to look out for. It was maybe I'm involved with some kind of a cult here. And so, for me, the alternative was so bleak that I really didn't care if these guys were from a cult. There was a smile on their face. There was something about them. They had this camaraderie that existed between us. And I just kept going to that workshop. And they weren't real nice to me in that workshop. They were, I would always pipe up, well, I got something to say about that. And they would start saying, well, what's your experience with that? And I would start, no. And they said, that sounds like something you think you know, but what's your experience with that? And I would have to finally admit to them, well, I've never actually worked this step. And I was just so frustrated. And these guys were just treating me rather shabbily. They just were not being kind to me. So finally I just decided I'm just going to shut up and I'll write this inventory that we're talking about. And I'm going to ask the guy who's facilitating the workshop to hear my inventory. And when he sees how horrible everybody's treated me my whole life, he's going to feel so sorry for me that he's talked to me like that in the workshop and that he hasn't let me share more in the workshop. And so I did that. I wrote that inventory, and the night before I was going to write that inventory, I nearly drank. It really occurred to me that because, and the guy, his name was Jeffrey, and Jeffrey was a real, and still is that way, he just was a real pointed guy about stuff. So I told him, well, listen, Jeffrey, I've been coming to the workshop now for a few months, and I'd like to ask you to hear my fifth step. And he said, listen, Kenny, I got no time to mess around with you. And I think his expletive was a little different than that. But he said, listen, I got no time to be messing around with you. So here's the deal. You finish that inventory by this day, and I'm going to come over on this morning, and it better be done. And if it's not, I'm leaving. I ain't never coming back. You'll have to find somebody else to hear your inventory because I'm a busy guy. And he was. This was a guy that was working with a lot of different alcoholics. And I won't go into it now, but this was a guy who'd opened up his home to alcoholics, people. He lived in a not that great of a neighborhood and had a kind of an open door policy with the street people. That everybody was in and out of his place all the time, taking showers and cooking stuff to eat. And you'd be over there reading the book with them, and these people would be coming and going. It was really quite an experience to see this. But Jeffrey came over. He came over to the car lot. There was a little apartment fixed up in the back of that car lot, and Jeffrey came over there, and I'd set that whole day aside. And I thought, man, I'm just going to read this to him. He's just going to be in tears. He's going to be so sorry. He hears all this horrible life that I've had. And just immediately, thank goodness, I did my fifth step. And I'm not suggesting this for everybody, but it was just my experience. I did my fifth step with a guy who really kind of rubbed my nose in it a little bit. He didn't let me escape from anything. And he didn't belittle me or he wasn't outwardly mean, but he would just kind of continue to turn the mirror and say, well, did you hear that? Did you see that? And as I went through all these resentments, I started looking at things in this different light. And Jeffrey refers to it as the day the blinders came off. And he said that he could physically see that in me when we talked today. The blinders came off. And he said it was like this, he describes this 360-degree mirror that I had around myself, which means that no matter what direction I turn, I can only see the reflection of how this reflects on me. I don't ever see outwardly. And he said, today the 360-degree mirror is going to smash. And we're going to look at this stuff head on. And we started going through all that stuff and all these resentments. And it's funny because I get asked to share quite a bit nowadays. And it's a funny thing because, one thing I know for sure about myself is that I'm a guy standing here today. I can tell you that I was wrong about everything in my life. I was wrong about my mother. I was wrong about my father. I was wrong about the teachers and those kids at school. I was wrong about my brother. I was wrong about my father and my grandmother. I was just wrong about all these bosses. I was wrong about these, the jobs where they'd fired me. I just had all this stuff built up. And one of the biggest ones, and I'll just give you an example here, one of the biggest ones that I looked at is that I had, and it was a pretty simple resentment as far as resentments go. It was against my mother, and it was just a simple resentment. She ruined my life, was column 2. No reason to go into that anymore. She's ruined my life. And I got a chance to look at that, and he was like, well, what did she do? And I mentioned all of these things, and, well, did nothing good ever happen? Wasn't there anything good? And I had to admit, well, maybe a few things. And, well, I don't know, did you have a roof over your head? Yeah, we did. She kept a roof over our head. Well, that's good. A lot of people don't have that. Oh, well, what about food? Well, it wasn't the right type of food. I'd have preferred the sugared cereal, but there was food in the house. Excuse me. I didn't starve, and then we started looking at some things like, well, do you ever remember having a Christmas tree in your house? And I did. We had a Christmas tree, I think, every Christmas. And then I started looking at more and more things, and I looked at this idea that, for one thing, my mother came to AA right about that same time that I took that first drink down at the school. She was going to her first AA meeting. I stand here today to tell you that my mother is over 30 years sober. And, yeah. And now I know the truth about my mother, because the truth is that we had a roof over our head, we had food in the cupboard. My mother was a folk guitar singer in the 60s. And so she would play at the University District next to the University of Washington. She would go to the coffee shops there and play for money, and she was very good. She actually had a record at one time, and so she played guitar, and I remember, as a young child, I remember that every night my mom would come into my brother and my room, and she would sit there and play the guitar and sing music to us until we fell asleep. Every night. I don't ever remember her not doing that. It was just like one of those memories that I just had decided I wouldn't remember. And, that's a loving thing to do. And the truth is that I grew up in the presence of great love. That's the truth. I grew up in the presence of great love. And I was the one who left and started committing crimes. And, my mom, when she got sober, the thing she wanted the very most, I know this today because we've talked about this, the thing that she wanted the very most out of anything in her life was to just a chance to be a good mother, and I totally took that away from her. I just was off on my own and just selfish and self-centered to the extreme, and I just took off and just went crazy on my own, and I never gave her that chance. And I got into a lot of trouble, and I was in an institution down in Seattle's way up in the north end of Washington. This institution was as far south as you can go and as far out to the west as you can go in Washington. So it was about a 4 or 5 hour drive to this place. And I was there almost a year. And she came when I was there. My mother came. The visiting days were on Saturday. And my mother would come every Saturday. She would come and drive down there those 5 hours. And my mother was poor. She still is. And she, so I know her resources were limited. And yet she would make it down there after work every Friday, every Saturday. She would drive down there, and she would be there for visiting hours every Saturday. I don't ever remember her missing a weekend. And here's the thing about it. There was visiting hours on Sunday, too. And my mom would spend the night there in that little town so she could come the next day and visit me on Sunday mornings. That's a big commitment. So this is the kind of awakening, that I've had and I continue to have in Alcoholics Anonymous, is that I see things through this different, the 10th step says that that by this time we will have entered the world of the Spirit. And that doesn't mean that by this time we will have entered an area in our life where we have no problems. It means that I'm spiritually awakened. It doesn't mean that I'm without problems. And And, because of that, like I see all these things from a different light, and I'm able to be this different person today. And one of the greatest gifts that I've been given is the ability to carry this message to others. And I spend, as much of my free time as possible in that effort. And my wife and myself, we have a home that has kind of an open door policy. We have people over for dinner an awful lot in our house, and she has sponsees, and I have people that I sponsor that come by the house, and we just have this great thing. We've had my daughter is 14 years old, started her first year of high school. She's never seen me take a drink. Yeah. We had an opportunity to take a young boy into our house, and we've had a chance to raise him up. And he was just a nice kid, and I'll tell you about him a little bit. Just a kid that needed a hand up, and we've opened our house to him and to a lot of other kids in our area. My wife is currently working with a neighbor kid who has a horrific family life, and this kid comes over quite a bit, and my wife goes over, picks her up, gives her a ride to school and stuff. And this AA life is really like developed into this deal where we feel we have this like happy and useful life today. And I was at an AA retreat in 2000, and it was like in the 90s actually. It wasn't 2000. I was at an AA retreat, and this woman from Colorado was doing the retreat. I think she spoke here last year. She was doing the retreat, and I was kind of the business end of the retreat, collecting everybody's money and that kind of thing. And I did that for 10 years, and then passed that on to somebody else. But I was there that weekend, and this woman came in, and she was just absolutely nuts. And I share this, with her permission, that she was just totally, totally nuts. And she was 12 years sober, and in sobriety, 12 years sober, untreated alcoholism, never having really worked the steps. She had a psychotic break in sobriety, and she showed up at this retreat. She'd lost her teeth, and it wasn't a taped retreat. She brought this hidden little tape recorder, and she was trying to tape everything that the facilitator had to say, and she was just being completely inappropriate and making noise. And so the group came to me because I was kind of putting this deal on, and said, "Hey, Kenny, well, what are we going to do about her?" And I said, "Well, first of all, we'll tell her she's got to quit taping, and second of all, we're going to let her stay and make her as comfortable as possible." So we let her stay, and she was a woman that I'd seen in AA a few times before, and she came in, and she came up, and she was just like, we took a little break, and I'd talked to her a few times and kind of got her settled down, and I was as loving as I could to her, and she'd seen me. She'd seen some of the changes in me, and we were outside. I was standing with my wife Shannon here, and Darlene just grabbed me by the collar, just like that, just desperate, just like, "Will you be my sponsor? I need somebody to sponsor me. I need some help right now. I can't. I needed somebody to sponsor me, and I need what you guys are talking about here." And of course, I was just like, wow, this was a bit much for me, but I'm looking around the room like, okay, I'm sure there's somebody here that can help you, And thank God my wife was there, and she's been the voice of sanity in our relationship for many years. And she saw what was going on in my head, that I'm like looking around for help, and she just turned to me and she said, "Kenny, you have to help this woman." And I got a chance to start working with Darlene, and I just did what was done with me. I had sponsored quite a few people by then, and I just took her to that title page, and I showed her that. She continued mentally to get a little worse, and she ended up in the psychotic ward of the local hospital, and she would call me from there, from the payphone at the psych ward, and I would read the book to her. I didn't know what else to do. I asked people, "What should I do?" They said, "Well, read the book to her. Tell her, share your experience with her." So I did. I just started reading the book over the phone, and we got to the third step, and I did a third step with Darlene over the telephone. We did our third step together, and I had her start writing inventory. She started writing inventory, and the fog started to lift a little bit. She got out and she had a young son. She was reunited with her son, and through some AA help and stuff, we got her into a little apartment, and I would go over there a lot, and she was one of these people that and God, it's just so beautiful when you get one like this. She just absolutely caught fire. she just caught fire. And today there isn't a woman in my home group, know it or not, that wasn't touched by Darlene's life. It didn't have, that can't trace her sobriety in some way back to the 12-step work, because she 12-stepped everybody that came through the door. She was just that kind of person, and she was just absolutely on fire with this deal. And she was taking people, she had this vision in her mind that we talked about, that she wanted to start this deal. She called it Freebird houses, and she just wanted to start these Freebird houses where people could just come and get detox on demand. Just walk up and say, I want detox, and she'd take them in. But she didn't have any money, so she started this out of this little apartment in Shoreline, Washington, just a little 2-bedroom apartment. And I was there sometimes when she'd have 3 or 4 men detoxing in that little apartment. And she got to be known kind of on the streets as like this angel of mercy. If you went and knocked on her door, she was going to take care of you. And man, we still have a lot of people in my group that got sober this way. And there was something about her that she didn't really want to tell anybody else, but because I was her sponsor and I'd heard her inventory and stuff, and like I say, I share this with her permission, that she had AIDS, and she didn't really want people to know that. So I knew that she was getting up and doing other people's laundries on days when she didn't even feel like getting out of bed herself. And she would get out of bed and do these people's laundry and cook for these people and get these people through heroin withdrawals and alcohol withdrawals in her apartment. She was doing that for these people. And I talked to a lot of people that got sober there, and they always said there was something about Darlene that I never had to take any medication. I never had to do anything, and that was the easiest detox I ever had. It was just like that overwhelming love. And the thing, here's something I want to say this. Her transformation was so dramatic that my wife here asked Darlene to be her sponsor years later. Isn't that amazing? She was the one that said, Kenny, you have to help this woman. And here it is, years later, this person was sponsoring my wife, because the transformation was just that dramatic. And I would go to see her, and I kind of noticed, there was a lot of drama and stuff around detox and all these crazy people off the streets and stuff. And here was this young kid, and I just thought, well, I'm her sponsor, and I'm a guy. I could see he probably needed to be around a man, and so I just befriended this kid, and I took him. One of my very favorite things to do is to go to Seattle Mariners baseball games, and I got tickets through my work, and I would just go pick him up and take him to games and take him to different things. And my wife and I would always buy him gifts on Christmas and gifts on his birthday, and they came to our house for Thanksgiving. I mean, it very much was a family thing, and a few years into this deal, Darlene came to us and she said, Jake just really loves Kenny. And if there is any chance that if anything was to happen to me, because you guys know that I am sick, would you guys be willing to take Jake? And we were like, Darlene was seemed a picture to health to us at the time, and we just, well, of course, we'd be glad to do that. We were kind of a little taken back by that idea, but we'd be happy to do that. I truly did love this kid, and he loved me, and we signed all the papers, went to a lawyer, and made the whole thing legal, and it wasn't maybe a year after that, Darlene called me, and there was something a little goofy about the way she was talking, and I could just tell that something wasn't quite right, and we took her to the doctor, and she just was at a place at that time with the medicines that they had, there was no saving her, and the doctors told us that. And I was with her son, as she took her last breath, and when we took her to the hospital for the last time, he came to live with us, and he lived with us from the time he's out working on his own and doing some stuff on his own right now. But he was 15, he's 19 years old. We watched him graduate from high school. We went to his high school football games. This was out of a 12-step call. I mean, it works. It really does, doesn't it? And that's the thing that I really want to leave you with is that that kind of transformation is possible. And I think I'll say just tell you one more thing here. that one of my very favorite things to do is to go down to these Seattle Mariners baseball games, and we've got a nice stadium, and it was a day game, and I'm with my wife, who I just love tremendously, and doing my very favorite thing, which is just to sit at a ball game with the cell phone off and just enjoy and kick back and relax. And it's kind of a meditative thing for me, and I just love it. And I don't know, the Mariners must have been losing that day. I wasn't in a very good mood, and I wasn't being real kind to my wife. And here I've come all this way, and yet I'm still got like a certain angst or something, and things I just, I've kind of lost touch with gratitude here. And we left after the game, and it was a sunny day, and the sun was going down. And I told my wife, I said, hey, let's go up to the hall and go to a meeting. And she said, well, going to the hall for a meeting isn't really what I have in mind. Let's go down to the beach and walk in the sand and hold hands and watch the sunset. And I'm just thinking, oh, God, you got to be kidding me. I mean, that's the way I was feeling. And so she won, and I said, okay, we'll go to the beach, and I turned off, and my wife is driving, and she does that a lot. It's something, I don't know if it was the glue I sniffed in the 6th grade or whatever, but sometimes I'm not the best driver, so my wife does a lot of the driving, and so we were, she was driving, and we were headed down to the beach, and then I just had this thought, and I just said, I realized where we were, and I said, oh my God, I said, turn here, and she turned, and we, I said, turn again here. And I said, now pull in behind here. And we pulled in behind there. And then she knew it. There was that McDonald's. And she'd never seen that spot. I'd never taken her there in all those years. And she said, oh my God, this is the spot, isn't it? And we were parked right there. And I said, yeah, this is it. And that gratitude started coming back, and just as we were doing that, a guy came out of the bushes from my spot. Right there. And he started walking away, and of course my wife again says, Kenny, you got to go talk to that guy. You got to go talk to him. And I did. I got out of the car, and I went over, and I sat in a little bus stop for about 45 minutes with this guy, and he wasn't really interested in AA much, and he was a little disturbed at first that I approached him at all. But it turned out he'd just come in from Philadelphia, and I was able to give him some decent help. I was able to tell him where he could go down to Fisherman's Terminal and take a shower for $0.25, and I was able to tell him where he could go get some free food. And my life had completely changed at this point. We're driving a nice car, and I own a house, and I got a good job, and I just don't look the part anymore. And I was just talking to this guy, and I looked down, I had a brand new pair of tennis shoes on, and his shoes were like tattered, and I thought, God, this probably fit. And I took my shoes off and I gave them to this guy, and he was grateful. This guy was like almost in tears, and we talked for a little bit, and his pride was kind of gone. He was trying to straighten himself up and look as good as he could in his tattered clothes, and we talked for a bit, and I gave him those shoes, and I gave him the little bit of money that I had, and I went on the way. I don't know whatever happened to the guy, and I got back in the car, and my wife said, well, how did it go, and what was he like? And what the hell happened to your shoes? And so, we got to walk barefoot in the sand and hold hands while the sun set. And this is the kind of life I get today. And I could stand here for another hour and tell you stories like that. I really could. There's a series of books out, and they're like one of the biggest selling series of all times called Chicken Soup for the Soul, and there's a whole bunch of them, and this is not an endorsement. I just am here to tell you that I've read a lot of stuff in that book, and if you come and do what I've done, and you come hang out with us, you get to live that way of life, man. I mean, I get to live that way of life all the time with these phone calls from that sponsee that just got, his sponsee just finished the work and went and got AA number 3, and to listen to Richard's story about being sober and the elation that he got from having his first guy get 1 year sober, and like genuinely being happy for the success of another human being, that part of the big book where it says, you will know the true meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself. So I will leave you with that tonight. I am just incredibly grateful to be here. I will say that I do realize that, in this area. I will have no idea what a lot of you have been through in this last year. And it's just, when I knew that the conference was still going to happen and that I was going to be able to come down here, I just want to tell you that is just an amazing gift to think that I can be a part of bringing some ray of light, into the lives of some people. And several people stood up when they asked that question here today. And this conference can do that. It's just such a great way to open this conference, to let people just breathe and just have a weekend of enjoying being in the spirit of a lot of sober alcoholics. There is not finer people in the whole world. Thank you.